Today's media call is being held virtually in partnership with Commonwealth Media Services. This media event is being recorded. For all participants, you will be muted upon entry. Please turn off your video for the duration of the event. We are joined by Acting Secretary Noe Ortega and Deputy Secretary Matt Stem for the Pennsylvania Department of Education and COVID-19 Response Director, Dr. Wendy Braund for the Department of Health. And now I will turn things over to Secretary Ortega for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Kendall. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining us on this media call today. I'm pleased to be here virtually with Deputy Secretary Stem, as well as Dr. Braund from the Pennsylvania Department of Health. We're hosting this call today to help answer questions you may have specific to recent updates our departments have provided to school guidance and recommendations during COVID-19. As you may be aware, over the past week and a half, our departments announced updates to our school closure matrix, instructional models, and physical and social distancing recommendations to align with recent updates from the CDC. While these recommendations are not mandates, mitigation strategies remain essential to opening safe, in-person learning environments. In addition, we recently completed the special initiative to vaccinate teachers and school staff across Pennsylvania. This was a heroic effort by all involved, and I'm proud of our intermediate units, our fellow state agencies, the National Guard, and AMI for the around-the-clock collaboration to complete this initiative ahead of schedule. Yesterday, I joined U.S. Secretary of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona in Philadelphia. He was here as part of his national school reopening tour and visited 2 schools to connect with and hear directly from students, educators, and families on their experiences during the pandemic and as schools reopen. I am grateful to Secretary Cardona and the U.S. Department of Education for their time and proud of our school communities for their strength, resourcefulness, and determination. The U.S. Secretary's visit follows his agency's recent announcement of additional COVID relief fund to states through the American Relief Plan. These funds will allow our school communities across the Commonwealth to address issues of learning loss, social and emotional wellness, provide academic support and support to underrepresented students, including those who may be low income, experiencing homelessness, English learners, and those with special needs. While we have come a long way, we must stay laser focused as we continue to move forward together. We're certainly not out of the woods yet, but we're very close. Please be reminded that our schools do not operate in a vacuum. And just like our communities, Pennsylvania's schools and districts are as diverse and unique and therefore have different needs locally. I'm incredibly proud of our schools, our school leaders, for the work that they do each and every day to serve and support their school communities. They've been making history for the past year and undoubtedly will continue to do so. Thank you again for your patience and for joining me today, Deputy Secretary Matt Stem and Dr. Braund from the Pennsylvania Department of Health today for this media call. Dr. Braund, I'll turn over the virtual platform to you now.
Thank you, Secretary Ortega, and good afternoon. My name is Dr. Wendy Braund, and I am the COVID-19 Response Director for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The Wolf administration is committed to getting children back into school while keeping them safe. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Department of Education for all of their collaboration and commitment to keeping our children safe while COVID-19 remains a threat in our communities and even classrooms. Together, our agencies continuously work to develop guidance and follow best practices set forth from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, better known as the CDC. Throughout this past year, all Pennsylvanians have united to fight COVID-19. Our schools have followed this guidance to best protect their students and staff. Parents, students, and our fellow neighbors have answered the call to participate in case investigations and contact tracing. We have gotten tested when we experienced symptoms or thought we might have been exposed. We have made sacrifices. We have worn masks, social distanced, and washed our hands even more frequently. Now we have 3 safe and effective vaccination options. We have the opportunity to find out when it is our turn to get vaccinated. When it is your turn, getting vaccinated can mean protecting students as they go back to school, just like the more than 112,000 teachers and school staff have done. All COVID-19 mitigation efforts, which now include the vaccine, remain critical in our fight against COVID-19, especially as we see an increase of COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations across the state. In addition to these increases, the CDC continues to report more and more variant cases across the country and across the Commonwealth. This is a reminder that we must continue to stay vigilant. Public health experts across the country are still learning about the variants. While there is still much to learn, what we know is that the existing mitigation efforts, hand washing, masking, and social distancing, all work to prevent the spread of COVID and variants. So we need all Pennsylvanians to continue to work together to combat the virus. Please take advantage of the testing resources we have available. If you have symptoms consistent with COVID-19, we have free testing resources available for you to get tested close to home. Continue to wear a mask, even if vaccinated, while out in public, as we work to protect those who have not yet received the vaccine. Continue to social distance when out in public. Educate yourself on the best COVID-19 vaccine option for you. Download the COVID Alert PA app. If you are between 13 and 17, you can download it with your parents' consent. And lastly, but certainly not least, each of us must continue to wash our hands and take steps to protect one another. Thank you to everyone who is playing a role in keeping our community safe and mitigating the spread of this virus. Together, we can all unite against COVID-19. Now, we are happy to turn it over to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Braund. We will now open for questions and we'll call on reporters in the order we received RSVPs. For time purposes, we ask that you please be brief. First, we will have Michael Rubicam with the AP, followed by Sierra Darville with WJAC. Mike, if you could please unmute and ask your question.
Yes, as you are aware, Pennsylvania is among 5 states that are responsible for 50% of all new cases across the country. How concerning is this? How likely are we to enter a second surge where our hospitals are going to be under stress?
So certainly, the case counts, the increase in case counts and hospitalizations remains of concern, and we are watching the numbers very closely. We have seen that the rolling average of cases, the 7-day average of cases, has stopped increasing. So practically speaking, what that means is that we are once again reaching a plateau. It is a higher plateau than we would like to see, but that is certainly good news and an indication that our mitigation efforts are working. It is really key to get folks vaccinated just as soon as we can. That is really our best defense. And certainly continuing our current mitigation efforts that are in place, as well as practicing the prevention behaviors that I have mentioned, masking, physical distancing, hand washing.
Thank you for your question. Sierra, if you could please unmute and ask your question. Sierra? Okay, moving on, we have Sarah Hofias Hall from the Scranton Times-Tribune, followed by Barr with WGAL. Sarah, if you could please unmute and ask your question.
Hello, this question is for Secretary Ortega. I've heard criticism from some people with some of the schools that remain in virtual or hybrid modes of instruction when they have received now a third round of ESSER funding. What would you say to those criticisms?
Sure. And so, we've continued to emphasize that what's been important in terms of returning back to in-person instruction has always been local conditions. And we've provided in partnership with the Department of Health, guidance to all our schools to be able to make those decisions. And I think as we see more of the resource coming in, more of the local circumstances changing with regards to transmission of the virus, we're seeing more and more schools do an assessment of whether or not they can move towards in-person instruction and then begin to do so. So, in many ways, these are decisions that are being left at the local level. So I just want to make sure that that's understood, and it's been sort of the philosophy of the department throughout this pandemic.
Thank you for your question. Now we will have Barb Barr with WGAL, followed by Karen Mansfield with Washington Observer Reporter. Barb, if you could please unmute your mic and ask your question.
For Secretary Ortega, when children, students come in contact, there's still the matter of quarantining. If there are cases, how concerned are you about the loss of school time due to the quarantine, also extracurricular activities, and even looking forward to next year? What do you foresee as far as those type of guidelines, mask wearing in schools?
And I think you raise a really important question. And I will also invite Deputy Stem to provide a few remarks with regards to the thinking that he's been doing along with DOH, particularly around quarantine and the continuing monitoring at the local level. But we are continuously taking assessment of what kind of strategies we could put out there, because once we move into in-person instruction, we want to ensure that we create conditions that allow for schools to continue to remain open safely as well. And a lot of this is going to come into understanding exactly what to do at the local level with their sort of localized mitigation efforts. And we want to make sure that we can continue to provide opportunities, which is why we have to continue to utilize some of the funding that's coming in to think about resources needed for continuity of learning in case there is pivots that need to happen by schools as well. And so we want to make sure that we understand how these two things will continue to work together as we move forward. Even now that we've moved through this phase of the special initiative with vaccinating our educators in the K through 12, we need to continue to think about those local conditions. Deputy Stem, I'm not sure if you want to add anything around the quarantine conversation or other efforts we're doing in this area.
Thank you. In terms of quarantining, first, we'd like to commend all of our families that have been responsive to the need to quarantine. It's those efforts and the willingness to engage in quarantine that's helped us to mitigate the spread in community transmission in and through schools. And so as we move forward, we would just say that the most important thing for our school leaders, our educators and families is to stay connected and keep those lines of communication open as they remain vigilant around mitigation strategies. And it's our hope that the changes that we've made to our guidance in the past couple of weeks that have come in line with many of the CDC recommendations will create the conditions for more and more students to continue to engage safely in in-person instruction.
Thank you for your question. Karen Mansfield, you're up next. If you could please unmute your mic and ask your question. Karen? All right, up next we have David Meekiel with the Reading Eagle, followed by Jill Greenwood with WPXI. David, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. There's been some evidence that some of the new variants of COVID-19 are having a greater impact on young people and kids than previous versions of the virus. At the same time, talking to local contact tracers, a lot of the work they're doing is involving cases in schools and particularly school sporting events. And at the same time, there is still no vaccine approved for children. Given all of that, is there any concern that some of the loosening of some of the mitigation guidance right now is premature?
So I want to emphasize that mitigation efforts are still in place. even though the gathering limits have been raised, for example. And so, yes, we do remain concerned. And that is why we continue, that's why we are laser focused on vaccinating folks just as quickly as we can. Certainly, we are watching the research, the evolving research around vaccinations in young people, and are hopeful that we will have a vaccine for teenagers in the fall. And of course, it will take longer for younger children, but we are on target to get to at least vaccinate teenagers, and that will certainly help mitigate the spread in schools as well as in the larger community, because as Secretary Ortega pointed out, the school is really a microcosm of the community in terms of the spread.
Thank you for your question. Now we have Jill Greenwood with WPXI, followed by Sarah Satuo with Lehigh Valley Live. Jill, if you could go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Jill? Sarah, if you could go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Sarah?
Hi, my question was actually already answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next, we have Brianne Ostrander with the Daily Review, followed by Mark Sims with Radio PA. Brianne, if you could please unmute your mic and ask your question. Brianne? All right, Mark Sims, if you could please unmute your mic and ask your question. Mark? Okay, moving along, we have Matt Catrillo with WKOK, followed by Carrie Pauling with northcentralpa.com. Matt, if you're available, could you please unmute your mic and ask your question? Matt? Moving on to Carrie. If you could please unmute your mic and ask your question. All right, up next we have Andrea Finney with CBS 21, followed by Rachel Yankunis with Fox 43. Andrea, if you could please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Hello. We know a part of the $5 billion in federal funding allotted to PA schools will address learning loss and academic needs of underrepresented students. What is the department's recommendations to best help students get back up to speed with so many behind? We've learned in some school districts, more than a fourth of their students will need summer school. Also, what is the recommendation for school districts and counties that tend to flip-flop? Sometimes when guidance is released in terms of COVID, what is best between hybrid, in-person, things of that nature, what is required, the counties actually flip back and forth between moderate, substantial. It's not very consistent. So what is the guidance to school districts?
Thank you. Yes, I'll respond to both of those questions. So first, starting with the issues around addressing learning loss, the department is very pleased that we have the new round of funding to push out to schools to support them, not only in addressing learning loss, but in addressing learning loss among some of the populations of students that have been even disproportionately affected during the pandemic. Our guidance for schools is, number one, to ensure that they are identifying the needs that exist among students, not only academic needs, but also social emotional needs. Next, we recommend strongly, our guidance is that districts put systems in place to differentiate and provide different levels of instruction for students based on the areas where they're finding students may have gaps, as well as areas that they may benefit from acceleration. So it's really about identifying needs and putting extra supports in place to address those needs. We believe that training is going to be important for our educators. They are going to really be required to engage in instruction in ways that may look different than they have in the past. We want to commend our educators for some of the innovative ways that they've been expanding their skills and providing instruction throughout the pandemic. And as we head into, throughout the remainder of this year and into next year, now's the time to continue to expand those skill sets and again, to put systems and supports, instructional evidence-based supports in place for students to address learning, any learning gaps and learning needs. In terms of school districts that are in...
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Before you go on to address my second question, is there funding available, a part of that $5 billion to allot to have more educators for summer school or to provide the teachers with more education training?
Happy to answer that. So the funding that is provided from the federal government, first of all, requires the most recent round of funding requires a 20% set aside for districts to address learning loss, number one. And then number two, there's additional funding that's being made available through the state for summer learning and extended day programs. And those programs are not going to be limited just to this year. In fact, many of the programs are going to be targeted over the next 2 to 3 years as that funding is available over that period of time.
Okay, and then what about the flip-flop?
Andrea, we need to keep this very brief, so if you could ask your question so we can move on. Thank you.
It's just readdressing the counties flipping from moderate to substantial, that inconsistency.
When school districts are in counties that go back and forth between, let's say, a moderate and a substantial designation, the department advises districts to try and stay with one instructional model for at least 2 weeks at a time. So there's less disruption to education. So when a county goes from one level to another, we advise districts to stay in the same instructional model for at least 2 weeks before then making any changes. Again, the goal is to minimize the disruption to the learning environments for students.
Thank you for your question. Now we have Victoria Lucas with Fox 43, followed by Josh Byers with the Tribune Democrat. Victoria, if you could unmute and ask your question.
Hello, thank you all for having us here today. My question is for Dr. Braund. So my question is for the parents. So we do have a lot of guidelines and increased mitigations, especially with the vaccine rollout, but with the increased vaccine rollouts, what would you say are extra precautions that are being in place or being sent to schools for children that are going to put parents at ease in sending their children to school in the fall and in the near future?
So, we continue, we have put out updated guidance per the CDC's new recommendations on the 3 feet distance versus 6 feet distance. And we discussed that in this forum last week. And so we have equipped the school districts, with that science-based guidance. So certainly it is important to maintain physical social distancing, physical distancing and rigorous mask wearing and hand washing, as well as disinfecting surfaces and paying attention to making sure there is good ventilation, particularly as the weather improves and schools facilities in general are able to open the windows, for example, and get better ventilation. Those are all important measures to keep the environment in general safe, and of course in our schools in particular. We certainly encourage the vaccination of 16 to 18-year-olds as is currently allowable through the EUA by the Food and Drug Administration. And then of course, once we have vaccines approved for our younger learners, certainly we would encourage uptake of that vaccine when it becomes available. And certainly at home, it is important to continue to screen for symptoms every morning, and do not send your child to school if he or she is exhibiting symptoms and not feeling well. And of course, that goes the same for our teachers and staff.
Thank you for your question. Up next is Josh Byers. Josh, if you could please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. I don't have anything at this time.
Thank you very much. Up next is Dan McKenna with 6ABC, followed by Christy Walton with Fox 29. Dan, can you please unmute and ask your question? Dan? Christy, if you could please unmute and ask your question. Up next, we have Jan Murphy with Penn Live, followed by Daniel Hanberg with ABC 27. Jan, if you could please unmute and ask your question. All right, Daniel, if you're on the line, could you please unmute and ask your question?
Hi, this is actually Taylor with ABC 27. I'm in for Daniel. This is for Secretary Ortega. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on students still having to take standardized testing this year? I know many educators were pushing to have the tests waived this year due to the pandemic and some of the stress that students were under with virtual learning.
Thanks for the question. And I'll also create a space when I'm done with my comments for Deputy Stem to weigh in as well, because his team's been working close on the assessment. But I'll begin by just reminding everyone on the call, when we think about the assessments and the guidance coming down, most of that is that's coming to us from the U.S. Department of Education. And so what we've done is taken what's the recommendation at the federal level and began to create conditions on how we could effectively implement that in Pennsylvania, given the considerations that we have to make for our school officials, for our students, et cetera. We recognize, like many folks, the challenges with regards to what we've seen because of the pandemic the past year. And what we've done is, with the help of the General Assembly, is to really eliminate some of the high stakes aspects associated with assessments and created them as a tool to help our school districts, our school officials really assess where students are now, and then again, where they'll be at the end of the year, and then making sure that we address what's even more important, that we put or provide them with the necessary instruction to really accelerate learning among all folks. Deputy Stem, as we move on this particular question, I'm not sure if you want to add anything for clarification to those folks listening in today.
I would just say in Pennsylvania, the PSSA and Keystone exams are still federally required to be administered. Our goal is to administer them in a way that is flexible for districts. So we are allowing districts to administer the assessment with smaller groups of students, and we're allowing districts to assess as late as into next September to ensure that they can safely administer the assessment. The most important thing is going to be for us to use the results in ways that are appropriate and meaningful. So when results come in, we will be looking at those for whatever insights that we can gather, including the impacts that the pandemic has had, even on things like student access to technology and similar type information related to the pandemic.
Thank you. And just to make sure, there weren't any new updated guidelines announced today. I did hop on a few minutes late, but just want to make sure there weren't any new guidelines. just with schools in general?
Sure. I would say what we're just one of the things that is going into effect next Monday are some changes to our instructional model guidance for schools that are in either the substantial or moderate counties levels of COVID transmission.
Thank you for your question. We have time for one more question, and that will come from John Finnerty with CNHI. John, if you're on the line, can you please unmute your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I guess, I don't know if you can speak to this or if you've figured this out, but obviously with it's being spring and we have prom and commencement and things like that coming up, do you have insight as to what you expect schools are supposed to do about that type of stuff?
As we look ahead to the end of the year, there are many activities like proms and graduation that thankfully our schools want to be sure that they're engaging them in ways that are safe and responsible given transmission in counties. The Department of Health and the Department of Education are going to be putting out additional guidance for schools to help them as they continue to implement all of their mitigation strategies while looking at what that would look like for end of the year events. We will have additional guidance coming out in the weeks ahead.
Thank you for your question. This concludes today's media briefing. Thank you for participating. Commonwealth Media Services will be sending a PACast with a link to the video of this media event shortly. Thank you again and have a good afternoon.